Hello, grüß Hal. I dag Schenkland, Ginter, all the blue in the middle. Welcome to everybody to the final Shankland of the year. Maybe wasn't the first?
It's the first and the final.
First and final! We're excited. I'm Evan Hughes. I'm one of the directors of the Stephen Colcroft Centre for the History and Culture of the Book, which is coordinating all this. But Sue over here actually knows more about what's going on. And I will pass you over to Sue.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming and a very warm welcome. It's a night of celebration. We are celebrating the launch of my colleague Helen Wilcox and Andrew Hiscock's monumental study, and I know it's monumental because I carried them over here, the Oxford Handbook of Early Modern English Literature and Religion. And I'm delighted to introduce Professor Thomas M. Corns. Tom is one of our former colleagues who also has been busy, available in all good bookshops as well, Milton and Catholicism. So, without further ado, Tom is going to talk in Donald Trump mode. The bonds that unite us, religion and literature in the 17th century. And once we've had Tom's lecture, we're going to link live to Montpellier, where Andrew is going to be on the video link, and then there will be wine drinking. So, without further ado, Tom, thank you.
Thank you. I was delighted and felt honoured when Helen approached me to deliver a public lecture in association with the launch of that indeed monumental Oxford Handbook of Early Modern Literature, English Literature and Religion. Though the invitation came at a precise time when I was pondering a rather tangential and unrelentingly tragic event, the death and injury of very many people at a conference in Las Vegas. I've been struck by President Trump's response. Speaking rather than tweeting, he observed with an appropriate gravitas, "America comes together as one, as it always has. We call upon the bonds that unite us, our faith, our family, and our shared values." Perhaps faith in America, or the American ideal, though more straightforwardly, more probably, this is a casual invocation of the Christian faith, reflecting perhaps an indifference to the actual complexities of America's many faith communities, and in the light of this afternoon's news, maybe also reflecting a rather casual and irrelevant Islamophobia. The invitation took my thoughts in a couple of related directions. My immediate reflection was how much early modern literary studies owes to scholars, American scholars, particularly of Jewish heritage, several of whom contributed to Helen and Andrew's collection. But I thought too about how wrong, how utterly wrong, the President's comments would be if applied to the European world in the 16th and 17th centuries. Faith was not a bond to unite, but a range of beliefs that divided and defined individuals and nations. Faith, indeed, separated families, provoked rebellion and repression, and supplied the casus belli for devastating conflicts. I shall, for the most part, limit my comments to the 17th century. Nearly all the major Anglophone writers of that era lived at least some of their lives against the backdrop of the 30 Years' War, 1618-1648. That includes Ben Jonson and John Donne, through to George Herbert, on and on through Milton to Andrew Marvell and John Dryden. That conflict extended from Transylvania to France and Spain, and northwards to the North German-speaking states, to Denmark and to Sweden. Though its causes were many and various, touching different participants in different ways, religious conflict, primarily between Protestants and Catholics, certainly characterized the taking of sides, at least in the earlier phases of the conflict. Its worst excesses bore the marks of sectarian conflict at its most extreme. Thus, in the slaughter without precedent in early modern Europe, the storming of Magdeburg, a Protestant city, by the predominantly Catholic troops of the Habsburg Empire, ended in the massacre of 20,000 inhabitants. The English political nation was certainly mindful of the continental conflicts. The early leadership of the Protestant axis was in the hands of the Elector Palatine, the son-in-law of James I and VI, the ruler of the three kingdoms of England, Scotland and Ireland. Indeed, the earliest developments in periodical journalism and news reporting in English grew out of a thirst for information about continental events. This is the front page. It's a broadside printed front and back, and you have a simulacrum of it distributed as a gift from the University of Bangor. It's a broadside printed front and back of the first English newspaper, or at least the first newspaper in English, printed in Amsterdam on the 2nd of December, 1620. And if you look through that, and it will give you something to read over the rest of this lecture, if you look through that, you'll see that overwhelmingly the news is about continental Europe. Within England, there was sustained pressure. Please. Better late than never.
I'm in full view.
You're also on the television, by the way. Right. Sorry. Within England, there was sustained pressure to commit English forces to the defence of perceived co-religionaries. Some troops were indeed levied, and some who were to fight on either side of the English Civil War had their earliest military experience in the 30 Years' War. Among them, Sir Thomas Fairfax, future commander of the Parliamentary Army, and for that matter, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, son of the Elector Palatine, and future commander of the Royalist Cavalry in the English Civil War. Note Sir Thomas's haircut. By the way, which is, I think, a nice response to the stereotypical notion of the short-haired roundhead. At the Battle of Naseby, Rupert broke through the parliamentary lines and reached the baggage train of the Parliamentary Army, the New Model Army. And he was mistaken by the commander of the baggage train for Fairfax, who approached him and asked him how it was going, as you might. And Rupert shot him, but missed, interestingly, though he was a crack shot. I'm getting ahead of myself. Arguably, the greatest triumph of Jacobean foreign policy was the king's success in keeping his countries out of direct involvement in the conflict. The early Stuart period saw a couple of small wars against Spain, and here a faith dimension in support of French Huguenots, neither of which went terribly well. Robert Herrick was chaplain in the latter campaign, a chaplain in the latter campaign. But generally, England, or at least the English political elite, looked on while continental Europe endured this devastation. Indeed, the court poet and masque writer Thomas Carey distinguished the Stuart peace from the horrors of war. Tourneys, jousts on foot, masques, theatres, better become our halcyon days. What though the German drum bellow for freedom and revenge? The noise concerns not us, nor should divert our joys. A poem which he wrote in response to an elegiac letter, as it had the title there, written by Aurelian Townsend on the death of Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden. But of course, he spoke too soon. The three kingdoms would soon get their own wars, stretching from the Battle of Edge Hill in 1642 to Worcester in 1651 and the final stages of the Irish campaign. John Morrill, in a cogent and influential account, has argued that issues of faith more keenly precipitated the conflict than other issues of civil politics and governance, and that religious ideology gave to those events their particular savagery. And a lot of my remaining argument, I must admit, rests on this point. The localist and legal constitutionalist perceptions of misgovernment lacked the momentum, the passion to bring about the kind of civil war which England experienced after 1642. It was the force of religion that drove minorities to fight and forced majorities to make major decisions. And this is the key sentence, quite often quoted key sentence. The English Civil War was not the first European revolution, it was the last of the wars of religion. Sides were taken by many, and taken for ideological reasons, in which, if Morrill is right, and I rather think he is, matters of religion predominated. Religious choices drove the political choices. In this context, this is the context in which the major figures of the mid-century English literary tradition took sides. William Davenant and Thomas Killigrew, who would dominate the theatrical landscape of Restoration England, were royalist agents. Aphra Behn, quite probably a royalist spy. Richard Crashaw was purged from his Cambridge fellowship, and Robert Herrick was purged from his Devonshire living. Abram Cowley, in exile, worked as a royalist cipher clerk. Milton, Marvell, and Dryden held posts in the civil service of interregnum governments. Catherine Phillips was married to a Cromwellian Member of Parliament. Richard Lovelace was variously imprisoned as a royalist activist. Indeed, Milton and Bunyan, Cowley and Davenant also saw the inside of prison, in Bunyan's case for some considerable time, and so on. So what were the faith communities which so divided the English nation, both in the 1640s and 1650s, and more widely over the century? The modern formula of all faiths and none doesn't really hold, in that atheists, as we would understand the term, are difficult to identify among the cultural elite. The term atheism generally carried a pejorative sense of godlessness or immorality, rather than indicated a philosophical skepticism about the existence of God. As in Milton's remarks on Belial in Paradise Lost. Who more often than he, that is Belial, in temples and at altars, and the priest turns atheist, as did Eli's son, who filled with lust and violence the house of God. Also, of course, a little bit of anti-clericalism creeping in into the poem at that point. And that's not the only point. John Wilmot, second Earl of Rochester, might appear a potential exception. Certainly he would seem to have produced an ideal reading for a humanist funeral. After death, nothing is, and nothing death, the utmost limit of a gasp of breath. Let the ambitious zealot lay aside his hopes of heaven, whose faith is but his pride. Hell, and the foul fiend, as he calls it, that rules hell, are, he says, I quote, devised by rogues, dreaded by fools. Yet, for all that apparent clarity, the issues aren't so simple. This, after all, is not Rochester speaking in propria persona, but rather as a translator of Seneca. As Helen Wilcox notes, this is the first ever footnote to the book we are launching tonight. As Helen Wilcox notes in her chapter in the Handbook, the language of the Bible pervades Rochester's own verse, even when, as in the poem The Fall, the subject is anxiety about male sexual performance. Nor would he be allowed to die unregenerate. As Gilbert Burnet, future Williamite Bishop of Salisbury, together with the family chaplain, toiled to secure his penitence, to be duly recorded and published for the edification of other libertines. In continental Europe, as in 16th century England, the principal dichotomy in Christians was between Protestant and Catholic. In 17th century England, the landscape was subtly different, though perspectives on Catholicism certainly shaped the consciousness of individuals. The cultural emphases of the Counter-Reformation on the worship of the Virgin Mary and on the contemplation of Christ's suffering are evident in Richard Crashaw's poetry even before his explicit conversion to Rome. As in, they have left thee naked, Lord, or that they had. This garment too I wish they had denied. Thee with thyself they have too richly clad, opening the purple wardrobe in thy side. Oh, never could there be a garment too good for thee to wear, but this of thine own blood. Upon the body of our blessed Lord, naked and bloody. That line, the purple wardrobe of thy side, is just so resonant, so memorable. The poem contrasts fascinatingly with an early work by Milton, the Passion. And we have a copy of this from, not from the 1645 publication, but the 1673 reissue or second edition of his minor poetry. We have a copy in our rare book collection here, and it is on display by the issue desk downstairs, open at the appropriate page, which has this rather curious phrase. In place of Crashaw's baroque precision and intense focus on the physicality of the suffering, Milton, after 55 lines of evasive imprecision, represents himself as breaking off. This subject, the author finding to be above the years he had when he wrote it, and nothing satisfied with that was begun, left it unfinished. Didn't stop him, putting it in the book and, and publishing it. Obviously, it didn't satisfy him, but it might satisfy you, dear reader. But anyway, it's there, and you can see it downstairs. Indeed, Milton would never really depict the crucifixion. But the conflict of Protestant and Catholic was not merely a clash of cultures. It must be set against the savagery with which it played out in the conflicts of the English Civil War, Cromwell's Irish campaign, and later in the century, in the judicial atrocities associated with the so-called Popish plot. I've got some title pages here to give you a flavour of it. Milton, like many who were to oppose the government of Charles I, was evidently deeply concerned with the fate of Protestant settlers during the Irish Rebellion of 1641, and was committed to the somewhat improbable figure of 200,000 as the body count of those slain. This is a wholly typical piece of piece of reporting, really, I suppose, about the Irish Rebellion of 1641. Worse and worse news from Ireland being the copy of a letter read to the House of Parliament, wherein is contained such unheard of cruelties committed by the Papists against the Protestants, not sparing age nor sex, that it would make a Christian's heart to bleed. The English Civil War was, for the most part, fairly civil in most instances. At least the first English Civil War that ended in 1645 was. It got a little bit less civil after that. Except when perceived Catholics fell into the hands of parliamentarian and Commonwealth soldiery. Hence, after the storming of the perceived Catholic stronghold of Basing House, there followed a spate of summary executions, here somewhat gloatingly reported in another news book. A looking glass, the Popish garrisons held forth in the life and death of Basing House, wherein is described her former vanity, present condition, and a friendly admonition to other malignant dens. There we have it, printed according to order. Hence, too, the mutilation of the women of the, perhaps the most signal atrocity of its kind, first of all, the mutilation of the women of the royalist baggage train after the New Model Army's victory at Naseby. In fact, almost all were probably Welsh rather than Irish, for whom the monoglot soldiers perhaps mistook them. The massacres of 3,000 or so, taken at each of Drogheda and Wexford, mirrored in miniature the fate of Magdeburg. But direct engagement with Catholicism was not at the centre of the mid-century conflict. As is in the case of most activists, for Milton on the one side and for Herrick on the other, the principal issues were about the fierce division within the Church of England between those who supported Archbishop Laud's promotion of episcopal hierarchy and ceremonialism and those who thought that ceremonialism represented a capitulation to the practices of the Church of Rome. Herrick's explicitly religious verse, appended as a sort of coda to the sometimes rather libertine secular poetry of his parodies, generally is plainly episcopal and royalist. Thus, the Laudian culture celebrating the beauty of holiness informs poems like the Parasive or Preparation. Parasive was the term for the day of preparation for the Jewish Sabbath, here carried over into the ritual preparation for the Eucharistic service. To the love feast we both invited are the figured damask or pure diaper over the golden altar now is spread with bread and wine and vessels furnished. The sacred towel and the holy ewer are ready by to make the guest all pure. The Laudian reform of the Church of England had laid considerable emphasis upon what was termed the beauty of holiness and invested quite a lot in making more beautiful the ceremonial apparatus associated with the rituals of the Book of Common Prayer. But magic towels weren't much to the taste of those who, like Milton, wanted the communion table reoriented so it wouldn't separate laity from clergy, and wanted the altar rails pulled down. But Herrick's Laudian aesthetic also informs at least some of his secular poetry. Perhaps his finest poem, The Hot Cart or Harvest Home, is quietly a poem of resistance. It celebrates ritual, albeit a country ritual, and the poet positions himself in priestly fashion as the mediating force and a force for social coherence between the agricultural workers, whose party this is, the sons of summer by whose toil we are the lords of wine and oil, and the landowner, the Earl of Westmoreland, whose produce they have just harvested. Some of Milton's most brilliant prose, his anti-prelatical pamphlets of 1641-42, is given over to attacking Laudian ceremonialism and prelatical church government. But for my contrast to Herrick, sorry, that was the poem I'd meant to show and I forgot. But for my contrast to Herrick, I shall turn to a later work, Paradise Regained, to exemplify the ideological survival of that which is not called amiss the good old cause, as he put it in the ready and easy way to establish a free commonwealth on the eve of the Restoration. I've noted how Milton averted his gaze from the most distressing elements of the atonement. For the regaining of paradise, he presented neither the crucifixion nor indeed the Last Judgment, though the Last Judgment does figure in Paradise Lost. Instead, he places the triumph of the Son of God in its most marginal phase, in the temptation in the desert. The triumph is a triumph of passive resistance. The Son beats Satan by not pursuing the political or cultural engagements with which he is tempted. That he is poor and in the eyes of the world powerless is emphasized, and his followers, the people who will indeed turn the world upside down, await his return on the periphery of their society. On the banks of the Jordan, by a creek, where winds with reeds and osiers whispering play, plain fishermen, no greater men them call, close in a cottage low, together got. The creek, a minor inlet. The cottage, again, a clear marker of social marginalisation. The great change will come, not from palaces and the corridors of power, but from zones of disempowerment. In the context of Restoration dissent, of Restoration Puritanism, the point is unmistakable. The likes of the Quaker missionaries and of still persecuted Puritans, ministers and lay are undefeated, waiting for their moment. The bond of faith that unites, not in the early modern period, but a precise understanding of that religious landscape sets a vital context for a historically informed reading even of the seemingly profane literature of that period. And it explains much about the distinctions between authors. Know how a man or woman worshipped or wished to worship, and you can predict where he or she would line up, not only politically, but also aesthetically. Helen and Andrew have done a great service and achieved much in assembling the materials that render with precision that religious context, and I'm delighted to be part of celebrating that achievement. But may I add another cause for achievement, celebration. This year marks the 350th anniversary of the publication of the first edition of Paradise Lost. Indeed, this very month of November quite probably marks the exact month of its publication. Since it is the finest religious poem in the English language, perhaps this is a fitting occasion to say, happy birthday, Paradise Lost. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for a marvellous Donald Trump impression and even better talk. Can I invite questions from folk? You're not going anywhere.
Okay, that's fine.
So if you have any questions that they would like to ask Tom. Yes, Tony.
I think I was very interested in what you were saying there about Milton, who I've not read closely enough to realise he was saying what you were saying about triumph, paradise regained, coming from being persecuted. I would argue, and I wonder what you think about this, that actually this is the true origin of tolerationist sentiment. We tend to think of toleration as something liberal. We like 1,000 flowers to bloom. That's not the point at all. The point is not to persecute, because to persecute is to be popish, to be anti-Christian. So certainly people like Burnet, who you mentioned, are caught in this dilemma that they don't actually believe in a diversity of religion, but they're not, under their own principles, allowed to do anything about it, because to try and stamp it out would be to become popish. And I think some of that imagery of the true church, of true virtue being persecuted, it's coming from Fox as well as other things, is what's actually explaining that shift towards tolerationist sentiment in the late 17th century.
I think I would, in the case of Milton, distinguish two phases, really. The first phase, which we see in Areopagitica, which is part of the 1640s tolerationist debates within the Protestant faith community broadly defined, in which Presbyterians were seeking to close down the more radical sectaries. Milton, I think, there is arguing in favour of toleration in a very tendentious sort of way. What interests him is toleration for himself, and that he wishes to define those boundaries in such a way as to allow the kinds of position he wishes to take up. And he's buried, according to the rites of the Church of England, he's buried in his parish church. He is married at least twice, according to the Book of Common Prayer. Not the middle one. That would have been the consistent. I forgot what it's called. The alternative prayer book that Long Parliament sanctioned, and Westminster Assembly wrote. So there we have him with that particularly discreet sort of 1640s moment talking about toleration in that way. What is fascinating is to leap forward to his last tract from the early 1670s, of True Religion, Heresy and Schism, where his position is very, very much like the position you're taking up. He is actually saying, look, the nature of Catholicism is, because it argues from implicit faith and from authority, is that it is repressive. And what we offer instead is a whole range of belief that is based upon Scripture and on free debate. But of course it's cognate with that other phenomenon that we find virulently in the 1670s, late 1670s and 1680s. And that is this bizarre take on toleration that characterises a lot of Whig activity, more or less in practice rather than the level of theory. And that is that bizarre take which is at once tolerant of Protestant dissent, but ruthlessly repressive towards Catholicism. And thus we have, if you like, the precursor, or the foundation for the Popish plot and the atrocities associated with that, which in part, of course, is opportunistic, because it's aimed at the future James II, who has declared openly his conversion to the Catholic Church.
Okay, any further questions? They're all stunned into silence. Right, well, I'm going to hand
there must be another question. Come on, let's have another question.
Could you do your Trump impression? I missed it.
Sad.
Loser.
Right, on that note, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Professor Helen Wilcox.
Andrew and I are very, very grateful for
gosh.
your honouring us with your
Oh,
lecture on our day. So this is from us. Thank you very
This is
much.
lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you.
How clever of you to have caught what I might like. That's lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And at this point, let us explain what's going on the screen. We are being joined by my co-editor, Andrew Hiscock. I'm Helen Wilcox, and we together have done this editing job on the Handbook. And he is on a 2-year research fellowship, a Marie Curie fellowship in Montpellier. So from the south of France, Andrew is joining us with 2 of his colleagues. And I think he deserves a wave. He can see you all. So I'll say a few words and then hand over to Andrew in Montpellier. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming today to hear Tom's talk and to share in our celebration of the publication of this rather large volume. And thank you, Tom, for demonstrating so wonderfully what a central topic this is to understanding literature in the early modern period. It goes through wars, family divisions, through aesthetics, and as you said, there's a presence on the page of this consciousness of religion, whether for positive or negative effect, in almost everything that's written at the time. So Andrew and I felt that this was a really key topic for understanding early modern English literature, and we were glad that Oxford also agreed. So Oxford University Press agreed to the proposal that there should be a handbook on this interrelation of the literature and religion in the 2 centuries, the 16th and 17th centuries. Oxford handbooks, as many of you will know, are these huge volumes which work ever so well as door stops if you need to hold the door open, but are collaborative volumes to which many people contribute, and they take a topic and offer new research on it. So it's not a summary of what has been said about the topic, but new adventurous approaches to it. It's designed for scholars and senior undergraduates and particularly postgraduates. So they're quite ambitious and long essays in them, and it comes out at 800 pages. So it's an ambitious volume. Just wanted to explain a little bit about how we organised the material, because you might say, well, this is a huge subject. How is it organised? How is it divided up? We decided to have 5 sections in the handbook. First, we thought people needed to know the lie of the land, the historical experience, the religious history of the time, to understand terminology, to understand the different moves from, obviously, the Reformation at the beginning of the 16th century, right through to the Civil War, to the Restoration, the rise of all kinds of sectarian groups, and so on. So the first section is unashamedly, chronologically progressing through the religious history of the period, but very much with a literary perspective, asking our contributors to think about the impact of these changes on the way people wrote and the way people read. The second section, we felt then we needed to introduce the literary landscape. So having introduced, as it were, the theological and practical religious landscape, then we went to the literary landscape and had a section on genres, the kinds of writing, which are many and varied, in which religious discussions occur, in which this kind of shading that Tom's been talking about, of aesthetic differences, how they show up. So obviously genres like sermons and devotional writing, lyric poetry, of course, drama, also prayer and translation, and a whole range of genres from the period. So those first two sections kind of setting the landscape in the religious and the literary fields. At the heart of it, the middle section, is a selection of key authors. We didn't want to do a whole handbook which was only focused on individuals, but we did have a section where some key major authors are considered in their output of religious writing. And then the second half, if you like, after that central bit, the remaining two sections go a little more ambitiously into topics. And I think this might be where perhaps we are doing something quite pioneering, in a sense that our fourth section focuses on communities. Because we were very aware that if you talk about authors, or if you talk about individual people, that's actually missing the point for many of the early modern individuals and their experience of religion, because they were always part of some kind of community, and we wanted to focus on communities as places of production of writing which had a spiritual dimension. So obviously religious communities like convents and so on, but also less definable, less physical communities like exiles abroad, or sectarian groups, the Quakers, and so on. And our final section, we took a small number of absolutely central themes to the writing of this period, in terms of the experience of religion and spiritual themes which dominated these individuals' lives and their community lives. Themes like how you relate to the Bible, how does science, the beginning of science, how does that relate to spirituality? What is the thinking about death and how is it expressed? We carefully constructed it so that we ended with death and judgment and eternity. We thought we should leave the book, we should exit the book at the point of going to eternity. So you can see that we structured it quite carefully to try to give a number of different ways of understanding this phenomenon of the relationship of literature and religion in the period. We don't expect anybody to read it right through, but that's the structuring into which people can dip, and we hope experience new approaches and enlightenment. We do think that in some ways we may be pushing the debate about religion and literature in the period in new directions. I would mention our emphasis on communities, which I think is an important development. Also an increased awareness of the presence of women writers in the canon. One of our test cases, one of our authors is Lucy Hutchinson, who has so recently really entered the canon of this kind of writing in the 17th century. And among our communities, we also push away from the local into exile, and also into the New World, and writers and the influence of religion on the writers moving to new areas. We have also considered non-Christian communities. We have the Jewish and the Islamic communities represented in our range. So we hope that we will be doing something useful in advancing the debate, pushing research forward. And of course we owe this to our contributors, and I wanted to thank them on behalf of Andrew and myself. There are over 40 contributors to this huge volume. Some of them are here today, which is absolutely lovely. Some will be watching this when it goes online, so we welcome you as well. There are collaborative, dually written chapters, so we're quite open to people's interaction in the book. And there are contributors from not only the UK, but continental Europe and North America. So it's a very large and varied group. And we do want to thank them, because without them, of course, there wouldn't be this handbook. Thank them for working along with our vision of the way we might explore this topic. But that's definitely enough from me, and I'd like to invite Andrew, sitting there in the south of France, to join us in North Wales, and add your own thoughts maybe about the book or the experience or whatever you would like to say to us, Andrew.
Thank you, Helen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Well, a big hello to everyone. Well done. I'll introduce my colleague before I say something about the book. I'm very pleased to introduce my boss and the director of the research centre here on the Renaissance, Classical Age and the Enlightenment, Professor Natalie Bienguerra. And we've got a rising star from our postgraduate community who has himself been working on literature and history. He's an expert now in Henry V. So it's down. So we're all here and we listen very avidly. I just wanted to say to Tom that the French jury is quite stingy with its marks. So I don't want to put the fear of God in him, but we will be voting later on this evening. In terms of the book, Helen's given an excellent introduction. I mean, personally, it was one of the most daunting projects of my career and one of the most rewarding. I don't know what the collective noun is for academics, but 42 academics together involves a long gestation period for any collection. I think Helen will agree with me, but we've learned lots along the journey. And I think the only thing that I would add to Helen's introduction to the book is that all the divisions that Tom was describing in his talk, I think are present within the book. We do find the chapters in dialogue with each other. We do find contributors sometimes disagreeing with each other, and I think that shows part of the vibrancy and the dynamism of early modern studies, that the debates are still unfolding in interesting ways. In terms of the future of the book, I mean, it would have done its job if we'd mapped out new territories, as Helen pointed out, which showed perhaps new avenues of inquiry to pursue. It never could be, even at 800 pages, it never could be an exhaustive volume. And some of the routes that we've taken, particularly perhaps, as Helen points out, through the authors, may displease some, but hopefully it will trigger and have a catalytic effect on some of the research which comes in subsequent years. But we've thoroughly enjoyed this evening, and we're a little bit further on in our evening than you are over here, but it's a real pleasure to be with you all again.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. And we're very sorry that you will only be able to join us virtually for the drinks. I'd like to just say one or two more thank yous. I've thanked our contributors, and Andrew and I both thank them warmly and for their patience and their excellent scholarship. We'd like to thank Tom again for making this a really special occasion and addressing so vividly some of the tensions in the period we're dealing with. Thank you to the library staff for hosting this event, especially Jenny, Sian and Ellen. Thank you to Matt for filming. Thank you to Sue and Eben, who are the co-directors of the Holclough Centre for the History and Culture of the Book, which is our host centre today. We're honoured to be part of the Shankland series. And I would like, on your behalf, also to thank the musicians who were playing when you came in. They're playing 17th century music, appropriately, of course, and they're going to play again while we have a celebratory drink. Drinks are going to be served in the corridor out there, and you can have a look at copies of the book. We're not expecting anybody to buy one. They're not for sale. You'd have to, bring your savings bank. But anyway, we want you to enjoy looking at it and enjoy the beautiful cover, which is Van der Weyden's painting, which is featured in the first chapter. I want to name the musicians. They're all from the School of Music, studying here. Alice Toulon and Miriam Dinnis are playing the violin. Zach Redding is playing viola, and Anastasia Zaponidou is on the cello. And I think they deserve a round of applause.